The November morning air over London carried a chill that seemed to seep into the bones, a fitting atmosphere for a day of national remembrance. The city had come to a standstill. Along Whitehall, thousands upon thousands of people stood 3 and 4 deep behind the barriers, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. They had gathered, as they did every year, to pay their respects to the men and women who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. But this year, the solemnity of the occasion was layered with an unspoken electric tension that crackled just beneath the surface of the polished ceremony. From the balcony of the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office, the view was both spectacular and humbling. The cenotaph, London's stark and powerful memorial, stood like a silent sentinel in the middle of the road, its white stone gleaming against the gray. And there, standing before it, was the king. From this distance, he was a solitary figure in his naval uniform, a single point of focus for a nation's grief. On the balcony, 2 women stood side by side, yet emotionally miles apart, the weight of the day pressing down on them in very different ways. For Catherine, the Princess of Wales, this public appearance was more than just a duty. It was a statement. The previous year she had been absent, her world narrowed to the 4 walls of a hospital room and the quiet, terrifying battle for her health. And cancer did not discriminate, and it had come for her, a young mother with her whole life ahead of her. She had faced the grueling treatments, the sickness, the hair loss, the bone-deep exhaustion, all under the glare of a world that was morbidly curious about her fate. Standing here now, in a perfectly tailored black coat dress, a poppy pinned precisely over her heart, was her quiet, dignified declaration of survival. She was back. The future queen was not just present, she was poised, a pillar of strength, her eyes fixed on her husband and her king. Her body was still, regal, a stark contrast to the woman who had spent months feeling her body betray her. Beside her stood Queen Camilla. The queen was wrapped in a high-collared black dress and a delicate lace scarf, her own 4-strand pearl necklace, a gift from the late queen, resting against her chest. To the casual observer, she was the picture of composed royalty. But a body language expert watching the broadcast would have noticed the subtle tells, the micro-expressions that betrayed a deep well of anxiety. Her hands, clasped around her order of service, fidgeted almost imperceptibly. Her eyes, while fixed on the scene below, flickered with a nervous energy. This was her first time back on this particular balcony, after missing the previous year due to illness, and reclaiming her rightful place came with immense pressure. She was the king's wife, and her primary role today was to be his anchor, his support system, all from a distance. The ceremony began, its ancient rhythms a comfort and a call to sorrow, the muffled drums, the mournful notes of the pipes, the absolute silence of the multitude. Catherine stood ramrod straight, her gaze unwavering. She was the picture of calm, but inside, the emotions were a maelstrom. Seeing William down there, following his father, standing in the very spot his own mother had once stood, and where he would one day stand as king, filled her with a fierce, protective love. She thought of their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, safe at home, and the world she and William were trying to build for them. Her return to duty was not about vanity. It was about legacy, about showing them that you face your challenges with your head held high. Camilla, too, was watching her husband with an intensity that was palpable. She saw the way he moved, the careful, measured steps. She saw the slight tremor in his hand as he stood at attention. Charles was not the young, robust man she had fallen in love with decades ago. He, too, was fighting his own battle, his own cancer diagnosis a shadow that followed him everywhere. From the royal car, she had seen him look overwhelmed. She had watched him swallow heavily, his emotions threatening to spill over as the memories of his own mother and the nation's fallen heroes converged. Her heart ached for him. She wanted to be down there, to hold his hand, to offer a comforting word. But protocol and distance kept her up here, a silent sentinel of her own. The moment of the wreath-laying arrived. It was the climax of the service. The king stepped forward, a solitary figure burdened by history and his own mortality. He laid his wreath of crimson poppies at the base of the cenotaph with a deliberate, solemn grace. As he paused, stepping back to salute, the cameras captured his face. It was etched with a profound sadness, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a fleeting second, the mask of the monarch slipped, and the world saw the man, a son who had lost his mother, a king grieving his country's dead, a patient confronting his own fragility. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant coo of a pigeon. He then turned, his movements stiff, and began the slow, careful walk back to the group of waiting dignitaries. He looked isolated, fragile, and utterly alone. And up on the balcony, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a knife. Camilla's heart clenched. She saw that fragility, that isolation. She watched him descend the steps with such caution, a stark reminder of his own physical battles. This was her moment. She had to connect with him, to bridge the impossible distance between the balcony and the street. Her eyes tracked his every movement, willing him to look up, to feel her presence. It was then that she made her move. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to those who knew it was a powerful, almost desperate declaration of love. Her lips, pressed together in a thin line of concentration, slowly curved into a small, warm smile. It wasn't a grin of happiness, but an asymmetric expression of pure, unadulterated support. A well done, I'm here, I love you, projected across the cold November air. It was a private message in a public place, and a lifeline thrown from a wife to her struggling husband. Catherine saw it. From her position, she had a clear view of the Queen's profile. She saw the softening of her features, the way her entire demeanor seemed to lean toward the solitary figure far below. It was a raw, intimate moment, and Catherine felt like an intruder. She understood that specific kind of love, the kind that watches from the sidelines while the person you love most in the world is under immense strain. But she did it for William every single day. For a moment, the hierarchy melted away. They were just two wives, bound by the same fierce protective love for the men in uniform down there. As the king's figure finally disappeared from view, heading back into the interior of the building, the focus returned to the balcony. The service was concluding. The national anthem began to play, a stirring, familiar tune that drew everyone together. Camilla and Catherine, side by side once more, began to sing. Their voices, one slightly deeper and more experienced, the other clear and strong, blended in the cold air. It was a moment of unity, a public display of the firm's solidarity. But as the last notes of the anthem faded and the crowd began to disperse, a new, more private drama was unfolding just out of sight of the public's gaze. The balcony was not a place to linger. Protocol dictated a swift and orderly exit. Camilla, as the queen, was to lead. Catherine, as the senior princess, would follow. But as they turned from the balustrade, the carefully constructed protocol seemed to falter. In the confined space of the doorway, their paths converged. There was a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation. Catherine, instinctively stepping back to allow the queen to pass, found herself momentarily in Camilla's path. It was then that the public warmth of the balcony seemed to evaporate. The air inside the doorway was still and quiet, a world away from the somber grandeur of the ceremony. A subtle shift occurred in Camilla's demeanor. The loving wife, the supportive queen, was gone. In her place was a woman keenly aware of the pecking order, of the delicate dance of precedence and power. As Catherine moved, Camilla's hand lifted in a small, firm gesture. It wasn't a violent shove, but a clear, unambiguous directive. a silent order to step aside, to know her place. For a fleeting second, the mask slipped entirely, ere revealing a flash of something harder, a territorial assertion of rank. This moment was not for the public, not for the cameras. This was for the inner circle, a reminder of the hierarchy that existed even in the wake of shared grief and unity. As Catherine gracefully yielded, her face betraying no emotion, the king himself appeared in the corridor, having just come from the cenotaph. He was pale, his eyes still red-rimmed, the emotional toll of the mourning etched onto his face. And seeing his wife and his daughter-in-law, he moved toward them. For him, the ceremony was over, and now he just needed the comfort of his family. He approached Catherine first, a gentle paternal look on his face. But before he could reach her, his path was subtly yet decisively intercepted by Camilla. The queen moved to her husband's side, her hand reaching out to gently touch his arm. It was a possessive gesture, a restaking of her claim. She murmured something soft to him, and her voice a private comfort meant for his ears only. Charles, still dazed from the morning's events, nodded, his attention now fully on his wife. Catherine, standing just a few feet away, was suddenly on the periphery of their intimate bubble. The brief moment of potential connection with her father-in-law evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. This was the first act of a much larger, more complex drama. A drama not of overt conflict, but of subtle glances, unspoken rules, and the fierce, the primal instincts of family, duty, and love. It was a day of remembrance, but for the three people at the heart of the monarchy, it was also the beginning of a new and deeply emotional chapter. The public had seen the unity, but behind the scenes, the tectonic plates of the royal family were shifting, and the fault lines were just beginning to show. The interior of the royal residence felt cavernous after the sharp, cold air of the cenotaph. The king, queen, and the Princess of Wales moved through the staterooms, a small procession trailed by equerries and ladies-in-waiting whose job it was to be invisible. The public duty was done, but the private day was far from over. For King Charles, the emotional release of the ceremony had left him drained, a hollowed-out shell of the monarch the world had just seen. He walked with a weariness that had nothing to do with the short distance from the car. They arrived at a small, elegant drawing room, and a fire crackling in the grate, offering a semblance of warmth against the gray November day. Tea was laid out on a low table, a silver pot, delicate cups, a plate of biscuits that no one would touch. This was meant to be a moment of quiet decompression before the next round of royal obligations. Charles sank into an armchair near the fire, the heat a welcome balm. He stared into the flames, his mind still replaying the 2-minute silence, the weight of the wreath in his hands. At the faces of the veterans in the crowd, Camilla, ever attuned to his moods, moved to a chair close to his, placing a comforting hand on his arm. She spoke in low, soothing tones, a private litany of support. "You were magnificent," she murmured. "So strong. Your mother would have been so proud." Charles gave a weak smile, patting her hand, but his eyes remained distant. He was elsewhere, lost in the ghosts of remembrance. Catherine stood by the window, looking out at the London skyline, giving them their moment. She felt the familiar pang of being an observer in her own family's life. She respected Camilla's role, her devotion to Charles. She understood the need for this private cocoon. But she also felt a pull toward her father-in-law. They shared a bond forged in the crucible of illness. They were comrades in a battle no one else in that room could fully comprehend. She had seen the tears in his eyes, the fragility in his step. She wanted to offer her own comfort, to bridge the gap between queen and future queen, between stepmother and daughter-in-law, and just be family. She turned from the window, a gentle smile on her face, and walked towards the fireplace. "Papa," she said softly, using the familial term of endearment she had adopted. The service was incredibly moving. You held the nation in your hands today. Charles looked up, and for a moment, his eyes cleared. He saw not the Princess of Wales, but the woman who had fought her own dragons and emerged, scarred but victorious. A genuine warmth spread across his tired face. "My darling Catherine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was you who gave us all strength today. Your first public engagement. It meant the world to have you there, a beacon of hope for so many." He reached out his hand toward her, a gesture of pure, paternal affection. He wanted to hold her hand, and to convey in a touch all the admiration and concern he felt. He had been so worried about her, just as she had been worried about him. In his mind, this was a moment of shared vulnerability, a private acknowledgement of their parallel battles. Catherine took a step forward, her own hand rising to meet his. It was a simple, human gesture, a father reaching for a daughter. But in that split second, a change rippled through the room. Camilla's hand, still resting on Charles's arm, and tightened almost imperceptibly. Her gaze, which had been soft and focused on her husband, flickered up to Catherine. It wasn't a glare, it was something far more subtle and far more powerful. It was a silent veto. Her posture shifted, a minute straightening of her spine, a hardening of her jaw. The intimate bubble around Charles seemed to solidify, becoming a barrier that Catherine could not cross. Charles, caught in the crossfire of these two powerful female wills, felt his wife's tension, and he hesitated, his outstretched hand hovering in the air for a beat too long. He glanced at Camilla, his expression a flicker of confusion and something else, a learned deference. The moment of pure, unguarded connection was broken. In the heavy silence, Camilla spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was firm, brooking no argument. It was the voice of the queen, not the wife. "Charles, you need to rest now. The doctor was very clear. You must conserve your strength." The words were directed at him, but their target was Catherine. They were a dismissal, a reminder that his health was her domain, his well-being her responsibility. The implicit message was clear. You are not to add to his burden. Catherine's hand dropped gracefully back to her side. Her face remained composed, a serene mask that betrayed none of the sting she felt. She had been gently but firmly put in her place, and the warmth she had felt from Charles just seconds ago was now a memory, replaced by the chilly reality of court protocol and the Queen's protective and possessive instinct. Charles, ever the peacemaker, looked pained. He didn't want to hurt Catherine, but he was also too exhausted to navigate this sudden, unexpected tension. He gave his daughter-in-law a small, apologetic smile, a silent plea for understanding, before turning his head back to the fire, yielding to his wife's command. But he let go, not just of her hand, but of the moment. Catherine stood her ground for a brief second, her eyes meeting Camilla's. There was no hostility in the princess's gaze, only a quiet, dignified acceptance. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the Queen's authority before gracefully stepping back. "Of course," she said softly, her voice even. "I should go and find William." She turned and walked away, her steps silent on the thick carpet. She felt a confusing mix of emotions, hurt at the rejection, anger at the possessiveness, but above all, a deep, weary sadness. Was this how it was always going to be? A constant negotiation for space, for affection, for a place in the family? She had just survived cancer. She had come back to support them. And yet, in that room, she was made to feel like an interloper. As the door closed softly behind her, Camilla remained by her husband's side, her hand a steady, a reassuring presence on his arm. She had drawn her line. She had protected her husband's peace. But in the quiet of the drawing room, with only the crackle of the fire for company, a different kind of silence settled between them, one heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The king's quiet plea for connection had been silenced, and a new, more complex chapter in the story of this modern royal family had begun. The door clicked shut, a soft but definitive sound that seemed to echo in the suddenly vast room. Catherine stood alone in the corridor, the silence a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere she had just left. For a moment, she didn't move. She pressed her lips together, a habit she had developed over years of public life, a way to compose herself, to lock away any emotion that might betray her. The polished floor reflected her image back at her, a picture of poise and elegance. But inside, for she felt a confusing turmoil, hurt, confusion, and a flicker of something she rarely allowed herself to feel: resentment. She took a deep, steadying breath, the air in the corridor cool and still. This was not the time or place. She was a professional. She was a Windsor. She would find William. But her feet didn't immediately move toward the wing where she knew he would be changing. Instead, her mind replayed the scene in the drawing room, the king's outstretched hand, and the genuine warmth in his tired eyes. Then Camilla's subtle shift, the hardening of her features, the firm, quiet command that had sliced through the moment like a blade. "Charles, you need to rest now." The words were for him, but the message had been solely for her. Step back. He's mine. It wasn't the first time Catherine had sensed this territoriality, but it was the first time it had felt so pointed, so personal. In the early years of her marriage, though she had worked hard to build a relationship with Camilla, she understood the difficult position the queen consort was in, the decades of public scorn she had endured, her fierce desire to protect her place beside Charles. Catherine had always been respectful, deferential even, careful never to overstep, always playing the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law. She had assumed, perhaps naively, that her own recent battle, her own vulnerability, would have created a new understanding between them. Instead, it seemed to have intensified something else entirely. A door opened further down the corridor, and Catherine straightened instinctively. It was one of Camilla's ladies-in-waiting, who offered a small, respectful nod as she passed. Catherine returned the gesture, her public face firmly back in place. She watched the woman disappear around a corner, then turned and began to walk, her heels making a soft rhythmic click on the marble floor. She wasn't going to William just yet. And she needed a moment, just a few minutes to collect her thoughts, to understand what had just happened. Her steps led her to a small, seldom-used anteroom that overlooked a private courtyard. It was a quiet, forgotten space, away from the grandeur and the watchful eyes. She slipped inside and stood by the window, looking down at the gray stone below. The sky was a uniform, leaden gray, mirroring her mood. She thought about her own mother, Carol, and the easy and uncomplicated love that existed in their family. There were no power struggles, no silent battles for primacy. There was just love, support, and an unwavering belief in one another. She missed that simplicity fiercely in that moment. Why had Camilla done it? Was it simply a wife's protective instinct? Charles was frail, emotionally and physically drained. Perhaps Camilla genuinely felt that any further emotional engagement, even a positive one, would be too much for him. Catherine could almost understand that. But the manner of it, the silent, possessive veto before he could even take her hand. It had felt less like protection and more like a declaration of ownership. A reminder that in the hierarchy of who mattered most to the king, she, Catherine, was a distant second. And then there was Charles's reaction, the apologetic, pleading look he had given her before turning away. He had yielded so quickly, so completely. It spoke of a dynamic Catherine had only glimpsed before, a learned behavior, a pattern of deference established over decades. He loved Camilla, That was undeniable. But did he also fear her disapproval? Did he tread carefully in his own marriage to avoid the sharp edge of her possessiveness? It was a disquieting thought.